40 days of rain until the entire world was underwater. 40 years wandering a desert that could be crossed on foot in less than 2 weeks. 40 days on a mountain without food. 40 days being tempted alone in a wilderness. 40 years sitting on a throne. 40 days walking the earth after rising from the dead. Over and over, across a book written by dozens of different authors, in different centuries, in different languages, on different continents, in completely unrelated genres: history, law, prophecy, poetry, biography. The same number keeps showing up, and it keeps showing up attached to the single most important turning points in the entire story. That's not the kind of thing you can just shrug off as coincidence. If any other ancient document you'd never heard of kept repeating one specific number at every one of its biggest moments, historians would immediately start asking why. So why does the Bible keep landing again and again on exactly 40? Most explanations you'll find online stop at one word: testing. 40 means a period of testing or trial. And that's not wrong exactly, but it's incomplete, and it skips right past the far more interesting question sitting underneath it. Because here's what almost nobody actually explains clearly. In the culture that first told these stories, 40 very likely wasn't functioning the way a number functions for you and me today. When you say, "I waited 40 minutes at the doctor's office," you mean exactly 40 minutes, measured on a clock, checkable against a phone. But ancient Hebrew storytelling didn't always use numbers that way. And there's real evidence, sitting right inside the biblical text itself, that 40 often worked more like an idiom than a precise measurement. Something closer to how English speakers say a dozen when they don't mean exactly 12, or how your own grandmother might say she waited 100 years for you to finally call her back, without either of you thinking she means a literal century. If that's true, it changes how you're meant to read every single one of these stories. It means the writers, in a lot of these cases, weren't reaching for a calculator every time something significant happened to their people. They were reaching for a specific, shared, culturally understood shape, a way of saying, this is the full, complete length of a genuine transformation, without necessarily meaning that anyone literally stood there counting days on a wall. So this video is going to do 3 things, in order. First, we're going to lay out just how often this number actually appears in Scripture. And it's both more frequent and stranger than most people assume once you see the full list side by side. Second, we're going to dig into where this pattern most likely came from, using the Bible's own internal explanations rather than guesswork, and being honest about where the number is symbolic and where it's genuinely literal. And third, we're going to walk back through the biggest of these stories with that understanding in hand. Because once you see 40 as a marker instead of a measurement, several of the most famous stories in the entire Bible read differently than you've probably ever read them before. By the end of this video, you're not going to look at the number 40 the same way again. Not in the Bible, and honestly, probably not anywhere else either. Let's start by simply laying all the evidence out on the table, in order, because it's the sheer volume and variety of it that makes this pattern genuinely impossible to dismiss as accident. Start at the very beginning, with the flood. Genesis is specific about this. Rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Genesis chapter 7, verse 12. Not 30 days. Not 50. 40, exactly. And the text repeats the number more than once across the flood narrative, as if making sure you don't miss it. An entire world, undone and remade, on this precise timeline. Move forward several centuries to Moses, when he climbs Mount Sinai to receive instructions directly from God. Exodus 24 verse 18 records that he was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. Then, remarkably, it happens again. After Israel breaks the covenant almost immediately by building and worshiping a golden calf, Moses goes back up the same mountain a second time, and Exodus 34 verse 28 describes the exact same 40 days, fasting the entire time, rewriting the covenant terms by hand after the first set of tablets had been shattered in anger. Then comes a story most people already know in outline. 12 spies are sent to scout the promised land, and Numbers 13:25 tells you precisely how long that scouting mission lasted, 40 days. 10 of the 12 spies come back terrified, convinced the inhabitants are too strong to defeat, and their fear spreads through the entire camp until the nation refuses to trust that God can actually deliver on his promise. And how long is the resulting sentence? Numbers 14:34 spells it out in the most direct language possible, tying the punishment number to the crime number on purpose. For 40 years, 1 year for each of the 40 days you explored the land, you will suffer for your sins. The text isn't being subtle. It wants you to notice the arithmetic. Skip ahead again to a shepherd boy named David, long before anyone calls him king. 1 Samuel 17 verse 16 describes the Philistine giant Goliath marching out morning and evening to taunt Israel's entire army, every single day, for 40 days straight, until David finally arrives on the battlefield and ends the standoff with nothing but a sling and a single stone. Later, once David actually becomes king, and after him his son Solomon, the Bible records both of their reigns using the identical formula. 2 Samuel 5 verse 4 gives David 40 years on the throne. 1 Kings 11 verse 42 gives Solomon 40 years as well. Two completely different men, two very different temperaments, two very different endings to their stories. David dying respected despite serious failures. Solomon's later years marked by compromise and division. Yet the length of both reigns is recorded with precisely the same round number. There's the prophet Elijah, running for his life after a dramatic spiritual showdown on Mount Carmel, so utterly exhausted and afraid that he tells God he wants to die under a solitary tree. An angel feeds him just enough to sustain a journey the text describes lasting 40 days and 40 nights. All the way to Mount Horeb, the very same mountain where Moses once stood centuries earlier. 1 Kings 19 verse 8. There's Jonah, sent into the massive foreign city of Nineveh carrying a warning that could not be shorter or more ominous. 40 more days, and Nineveh will be overthrown. Jonah 3 verse 4. A countdown handed to an entire city to see whether its people would change course before the number ran out. There's the prophet Ezekiel, commanded to lie on his side as a strange, living, symbolic act representing Israel's coming punishment. 40 days, explicitly representing 40 years, Ezekiel 4 verse 6, with the writer doing the conversion math out loud for the reader. There's an easy one people forget entirely. When Jacob dies in Egypt, his son Joseph has him embalmed according to Egyptian custom, and Genesis 50 verse 3 notes it took 40 days, for that is how long it takes to embalm a body. A rare case where 40 is used almost clinically, as a plain historical detail rather than a loaded symbol, which itself becomes an important clue later in this video. There's also a boundary the law itself sets on physical punishment. Deuteronomy 25 verse 3 limits flogging to 40 lashes, no more, specifically so a guilty person isn't degraded in the eyes of the community, a limit Paul references centuries later in 2 Corinthians 11 verse 24, recalling that he personally received 40 lashes minus 1 on 5 separate occasions. Notice that 1 minus 1, not a rounded phrase, an exact, careful count, deliberately kept one short of the legal maximum. And then the New Testament picks up the number without missing a single beat. Before Jesus ever preaches one sermon or performs one miracle, he's led into the wilderness and fasts 40 days and 40 nights, facing direct, personal temptation. Matthew chapter 4, verse 2, and Luke chapter 4, verse 2, both independently recording the same figure. And after his resurrection, before ascending, Acts chapter 1, verse 3 says Jesus appeared to his followers over a period of 40 days, giving what the text calls many convincing proofs that he was alive. Flood, Sinai twice, the scouting of Canaan, the wilderness sentence, Goliath's taunt, 2 kings' reigns, Elijah's flight, Nineveh's warning, Ezekiel's symbolic act, an embalming, a legal punishment limit, temptation in the wilderness, resurrection appearances. That's 13 separate instances, spanning roughly 15 centuries of writing, by authors who in most cases never read each other's work at all, and the overwhelming majority of them reach for this exact same number at the exact moment something fundamental is about to change. That is simply too consistent, too spread out, and too specific to be random. The only question genuinely left standing is why. Before getting into where this number actually comes from, it's worth pausing here for just a second. If patterns like this one, the kind hiding in plain sight across dozens of Bible stories, the kind almost nobody bothers to lay out this clearly, side by side, with the actual verses attached, are the sort of thing you find genuinely fascinating, this channel exists specifically to dig these out, one at a time, using real sources instead of guesswork or recycled internet trivia. Subscribing means you won't miss the next one when it goes up. And what's coming next is exactly the part almost every other video on this same topic skips entirely. It's easy enough to notice that 40 shows up a lot. Plenty of channels have made that same list. It's much harder, and honestly much more interesting, to actually explain why ancient Hebrew writers, across so many centuries and so many completely different literary genres, kept independently reaching for this one specific number instead of 30 or 50 or a clean round 100. The answer isn't mystical, and it isn't some hidden code waiting to be cracked. It's something much closer to how language itself actually works, how certain numbers, inside certain cultures, quietly stop being pure arithmetic and start becoming shorthand for an entire shared idea. Once you see how that shorthand functioned in the ancient world, every single story on that list reads differently. Let's get into it. Here's the honest, well-supported answer. In ancient Hebrew, and across the wider ancient Near Eastern world that Israel was culturally part of, the number 40 regularly functioned less like a precise measurement and more like an idiomatic figure for a full generation or a complete, extended period, used roughly the way modern speakers say for ages or a whole lifetime, without meaning a literal, countable span. The clearest evidence for this sits right inside the biblical text itself, explaining its own numbers rather than leaving readers to guess. Numbers 32 to 13 explains the 40 years in the wilderness this way. God made Israel wander in the wilderness until the whole generation of those who had done evil in the eyes of the Lord was gone. Read that carefully. The number 40 isn't actually the point of the sentence. The point is an entire generation dying off and a different one rising to take its place. 40 is simply the round figure this culture used to describe the rough natural span of an adult generation's active life, in roughly the same way you might round a friend's entire career to about 20 years, without meaning exactly 240 individual months. This lines up closely with something scholars have long noted about how numbers functioned in ancient Semitic storytelling more broadly. Round numbers built on culturally significant bases, 7, 10, 40, 70, routinely worked as formulas signaling completeness or a full, closed cycle, not as exact tallies a modern accountant would need to sign off on. Other ancient Near Eastern texts from the same broader region also reach for 40 as a stock figure marking an extended but bounded stretch of time in their own flood accounts and royal court records, written independently of Israel's own scribes. That strongly suggests 40 wasn't a private code invented uniquely by Hebrew writers, but a shared storytelling convention already circulating in the world Israel lived inside. One its writers borrowed, and then filled with their own specific theological meaning about God's dealings with his people. That doesn't mean every single 40 in the Bible is purely symbolic and none of them are literal, and it's worth being honest about that nuance rather than flattening 13 very different texts into one blanket rule. Some of these numbers were almost certainly tracked with real, deliberate precision. The 40 years of wilderness wandering, for instance, is treated by the text as an actual measured sentence, directly and explicitly tied to the 40 days of scouting that caused it, day for year, exactly as Numbers 14:34 spells out in so many words. The 40 lashes minus 1 that Paul describes is about as literal and countable as a number gets. It's a legal ceiling, and the -1 detail only makes sense if everyone involved was counting exactly every single stroke, on purpose, out of a documented fear of miscounting and crossing the legal line by even a single lash. And Jacob's 40-day embalming reads like a plain historical fact borrowed from known Egyptian mortuary practice, with no symbolic weight attached to it at all. The writers clearly could do, and did do, precise arithmetic whenever the specific story called for it. What the wider pattern actually shows is something more interesting than either extreme. More interesting than every 40 is fake, and more interesting than every 40 is a literal, exact count. It shows that 40 had become this culture's go-to number for one very specific kind of moment. The space between an old reality fully ending and a genuinely new one beginning. Whether a given writer was counting literal days on the ground or reaching for a familiar, shared formula everyone in the audience would immediately recognize, they were reaching for it because of what the number had already come to represent inside their culture. Completeness, a full and sufficient testing period. Roughly the length of time it takes for something old to entirely finish before something new can credibly start in its place. That's why it shows up at a flood that ends one world and begins another. That's why it shows up at Sinai, where an escaped population of former slaves becomes a covenant nation bound by written law. That's why it shows up across a wilderness, where a generation shaped entirely by slavery has to fully pass away before a free generation, one that had never personally known Egypt, can walk into the promise instead. The number was never really, at its core, about counting days. It was about marking a threshold, and once you start seeing it that way, this pattern stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like a language, one that 13 different biblical writers, across 15 centuries, all somehow inherited and kept fluently speaking. Once you see 40 as a marker for a complete threshold, rather than a strict literal countdown, watch what happens when you walk back through the biggest of these stories with that lens in hand, because the pattern doesn't just repeat itself here. It deepens every single time. Take the flood again, now with fresh eyes. It isn't simply describing a long, unpleasant rainstorm. Genesis frames the entire episode as the old, thoroughly corrupted world being fully undone so a renewed one can genuinely begin. Noah, his family, and the animals stepping out afterward onto ground that functions, within the story's own logic, as a fresh start for creation itself, complete with a rainbow covenant immediately afterward. 40 here marks the complete undoing of one world and the complete beginning of the next. It isn't primarily a weather report. It's a hinge on which the entire story of humanity turns. Take Moses on the mountain. He climbs up as a former shepherd, a man who once fled Egypt after killing someone in a moment of rage, a reluctant leader who spent an entire chapter arguing with God about his own inadequacy for the job. He comes back down as the lawgiver, physically carrying an actual covenant carved in stone, his own face reportedly glowing so brightly from the encounter that the people were afraid to come near him, according to Exodus 34 verses 29 to 30. 40 days marks the complete distance between ordinary, self-doubting man and carrier of God's covenant to an entire nation. Whatever exactly happened on that mountain, the text is telling you plainly. This specific length of time is what a transformation this large required. Not an arbitrary deadline, but the full, complete shape of a change too enormous to describe any other way. Take the wilderness generation, maybe the most painful single example on the entire list. An entire population that had personally watched plagues fall on Egypt, personally walked through a sea parted on dry ground, and still, at the very last threshold, couldn't bring themselves to trust that God would finish what he'd started. 40 years wasn't a punishment measured out in a courtroom sense. handed down coldly from a judge's bench. It was, according to the text's own explanation in Numbers 32-13, exactly the length of time required for that specific fearful generation to fully pass away, so that a different generation, one that hadn't personally lived enslaved and hadn't personally stood frozen in unbelief at the border, could walk into the promise in their place instead. The number marks the full, complete boundary between an old identity dying out and a new one being born, quite literally, in the middle of that very wilderness. And then there's Jesus. And this is where the pattern reaches its sharpest, most deliberate point, because both Matthew and Luke frame his 40 days in the wilderness as a pointed, structured echo of Israel's own 40 years. Israel wandered 40 years and repeatedly failed the test along the way, grumbling for bread when hungry, doubting God's protection when threatened, worshiping a golden calf out of sheer impatience while waiting on a promise. Jesus, alone in the wilderness for 40 days, faces the structurally identical set of tests, turns stones into bread to satisfy his own hunger, force God's hand by testing his protection directly, gain the entire world by worshiping something other than God. And where an entire nation failed across 40 years, one man succeeds across 40 days, quoting the book of Deuteronomy back at the tempter each time. The very same book that records Israel's original failure in the first place. The number isn't decorative background detail here. It is, quite literally, the whole point of the scene. Matthew is deliberately telling every reader who knew their own scriptures, watch this story rewrite that one, point for point. Then, at the very close of his earthly life, the number appears one final time, at the resurrection itself. Acts 1 verse 3 records that Jesus spent 40 days appearing to his followers after rising from the dead, offering what the text specifically calls many convincing proofs, before finally ascending. Whatever else that 40-day period accomplished behind the scenes, it functions as precisely the same kind of threshold every other 40 on this entire list has already marked. The complete, sufficient span of time between an ending that looked absolutely final, a crucifixion followed by a sealed and guarded tomb, and a new reality being fully, repeatedly, undeniably established in the direct experience of the very people who would go on to tell this whole story to the rest of the world. 13 different instances, 15 centuries, completely different authors, genres, and circumstances, most of whom never read a word the others wrote. And in nearly every one of the biggest, most consequential cases, 40 marks the exact same kind of moment. Not a random stretch of time to be endured, but the full, complete distance between something ending and something new, something real, something durable enough to build an entire future on, finally beginning to stand in its place. That's the meaning almost nobody spells out this clearly. 40 isn't primarily the Bible's way of counting days. It's the Bible's way of marking the precise shape of a complete transformation, nearly every single time one shows up on the page. So here's the honest, layered answer to the question this entire video started with. 40 keeps showing up in the Bible partly because ancient Hebrew storytelling used it as a shared cultural formula for a full generation or a complete cycle, a convention Israel's writers held in common with the wider ancient world surrounding them, and partly because, once that formula existed and everyone recognized it, the biblical writers kept deliberately reaching for it, on purpose, every time they wanted to mark the precise, complete distance between an old reality ending and a genuinely new one beginning. Sometimes that number was tracked with real, careful precision, right down to the last lash of a whip. Sometimes it was a shared formula, filled with theological weight instead of a literal tally. Both things are true inside the very same book, and the text itself, read closely, gives you what you need to tell which is which. Here's what that actually means for you, watching this right now. If you happen to be in the middle of a season that feels like it's dragging on far longer than it reasonably should, a wait, a trial, a stretch of life where the old version of you clearly isn't working anymore, But the new version hasn't fully arrived yet either. This pattern isn't telling you to start counting days on a calendar, watching for day 40 specifically. It's telling you something more useful than that this in-between space, however long it actually turns out to be in your own life, has a shape and a purpose behind it. It isn't empty, wasted time. It's the specific, necessary distance between who you used to be and who you're currently being made into. Next time you read a Bible story and the number 40 shows up on the page, don't reach for a calculator first. Reach for the question the number is actually asking you to notice instead. What's fully ending here, and what's genuinely about to begin? If breaking down patterns like this one, hiding in plain sight across the whole of Scripture, is something you'd like more of, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which of these 1340s surprised you the most. Thanks for watching.